We're going to start this video with an unboxing, and you'll see why in a minute. Oh, interesting. Let's set those aside for a minute here. This is what we're going to talk about today. This is a GammaChrome S18 Pro, and this was sent by Mike, formerly of the popular F2F Tech channel, and he had this card in his collection for some time and it needed some work. He sent it to somebody to be recapped, but because he's no longer making videos, he asked if I wanted to cover it, because it's always something he's wanted to cover, and it's always something that I thought should get covered. And he actually sent it with two different coolers, this being the original one that came with it, it's a bit beat up, and this being one that he found later that is new old stock. But this card is something really special and interesting, and also something I need to do a bunch of research on. So when we get back, I'll share everything I've learned about this card, and we'll go over potentially some testing if it works. So join me as we take a look at the S3 GammaChrome S18 Pro. This is PixelPipes. S3 has quite a storied history with graphics cards. They started off with Windows GUI accelerator cards, and by the time they added support for the PCI standard, they were already a respected name for good performing cards at a competitive price. To this day, their 2D cards are among the favorites for retro enthusiasts building DOS gaming machines due to their fantastic compatibility and speed. But when it came to 3D acceleration, they didn't have the greatest start. Their first entry was the notorious Verge, announced in late 1995 with availability early the following year. This actually made it one of the earliest 3D accelerators for the PC, with a feature set that was actually pretty impressive back in its day, supporting texture filtering, perspective correction, fog, grow shading, and so on. Unfortunately, it simply lacked the performance to utilize those features at decent frame rates, and you could scarcely play a game at any resolution higher than 320 by 240. It seems obligatory to mention, but you've probably heard it referred to as the 3D decelerator, as on many Pentium machines the performance was actually worse than software rendering. While there were several improved versions of the Verge released over time, this one in particular is the DX, released a little bit later, they never really gained much in performance, and thus the attention and respect of gamers, though they saw quite a bit of success in the OEM pre-built market. Things would get a lot better in 1998 with the launch of the Savage 3D, a graphics card aimed at the mid-range market, occupied by the likes of the Voodoo Banshee and the Matrox G200. In this segment, it competed very well, and while perhaps not achieving the sales of its competitors, it finally put S3 in the running as a contender in the 3D market. S3 would follow that up with the Savage 4 line, which unfortunately was a disappointment performance-wise, but offered a number of low-cost options for those on a tight budget, and at least for some of them, seem to have been snatched up in the OEM market. Plus, weird things like this appeared around that time, which I really need to talk about at some point. But S3 was always sort of a bridesmaid, never a bride, when it came to being a success in the market. And By that I mean, while S3 never led the market, they did contribute key innovations to the industry as a whole, namely S3's texture compression technology, which allowed much higher resolution textures to be stored in a smaller memory footprint. In fact, it was so impressive that Microsoft would go on to include it in the DirectX 6 standard feature set, and other 3D chipset designers would include support for it later on. Then in 1999, you had the Savage 2000, which was a very ambitious card that was supposed to go up against the likes of NVIDIA's GeForce 256, itself a monster in its day. Of course, for various reasons, that didn't really pan out. But it's a really interesting footnote in their history, and really the last time they sought after the high-performance market. Shortly after that, S3's 3D graphics division was purchased by VIA, and things went quiet for a few years. Then in 2003, they released the Deltachrome series, ditching the Savage name and starting from scratch. And this is really where our story for today's video begins. You see, in 2003, the GPU market was really in the midst of the DirectX 9 era, a time of revolution in the industry in more ways than one, and it was really thought that you had to be a major player in the market to even be able to handle the high demands of DirectX 9 rendering effects. I mean, if NVIDIA was struggling with it, anyone could. But it turns out that 2003 was kind of a last hurrah for smaller outsiders trying to compete in the GPU race. Matrox gave it one last go the year before. XGI, a spinoff of SIS, announced a line of Valeri V8 cards with DirectX 9 support, and then there was S3. The Deltachrome was their weapon in the DirectX 9 war, and they were aiming for the biggest segment of the market. Specifically, the Deltachrome S8, which was announced in 2003 with availability early the next year. It was shooting for the meat and potatoes portion of the GPU industry, the mid-range market. To do that, it sported a very respectable 8 PixelPipes, 300 MHz core and memory clock, and most importantly, full support for DirectX 9. Unfortunately, reviews and previews of the card haven't survived very well over time, even on the Internet Archive. But its slightly faster Nitro variant at 325 MHz seemed to perform okay against rivals like the Radeon 9600 XT and GeForce FX 5700 Ultra, though it clearly doesn't beat either of them. But the beloved AGP interface that these cards were built on was nearing the end of its life. On the horizon was the promising new PCI Express standard, and everyone was quick to jump on board. S3 was no exception, and in March of 2004, they were among the first to announce a new family of products to support the new futuristic interface. This would be the GammaChrome series, which, given the name, is unsurprisingly a direct follow-up to the previous Deltachrome line. Although they weren't promising much in the way of architectural improvements, they were touting a new and improved Chromation 2.0 feature set, which was their programmable video processing engine, as a reason to get excited. So that was maybe not very promising. To be fair, both ATI and NVIDIA started off their PCI Express support by also recycling existing AGP products. ATI did this by editing the actual GPU design itself to swap out its internal interface from AGP to PCI Express, turning, for example, the RV360 used for the 9600 XT into the RV380 used for the X600 XT. NVIDIA took the more thrifty approach of just slapping an external HSI bridge chip onto their boards, which could take existing GeForce FX GPUs and convert them to work on PCI Express. They renamed them to the GeForce PCX series, distinguishing them from the dozens of other FX cards already flooding the market. There was just one itty-bitty problem, though. While they were quick to announce them, the original Q4 release date for that year would slip by. The earliest previews I found were all from March of 2005, literally a year after their announcement. That's not good if you're targeting the launch of PCI Express and early adopters, but it gets worse. The S18 GPU was bafflingly cut down to only 4 pixel pipes, half of the S8 Delta Chrome. S3 did boost the clocks, but not nearly enough to make up the difference. It started at 400 MHz on the core for the lowest Pro model, but that's only 75 MHz higher than the Delta Chrome S8 Nitro. The S18 Ultra was only 500 MHz, just 175 MHz higher. So we're not off to a great start, and reviewers at the time were less than enthusiastic. While I've been able to find one preview of the middle child S18 Nitro from Beyond 3D, no one else seemed to even be interested in testing them. The tech report even went so far as to put out a statement of sorts, basically saying they wouldn't review the card, citing limited availability as the main reason. You see, the Delta Chrome line, which the tech report did preview, was never widely available for purchase. Board partner support was largely non-existent, and S3's solution for the distribution issue was to open their own web store called G-Store, and selling what I'm assuming were all S3 built cards directly to consumers. Unfortunately, most of the remnants of the G-Store seem to have disappeared off the internet, so I couldn't verify what was on there. But from what I've gathered, that was really the only way to buy most of S3's discrete graphics cards in their final years. But even if you could buy them, the value proposition wasn't the best. While no surviving archive of the store exists while it was active, the Tech Report's article cites the S18 Pro as costing $149.99, which, as they noted, put the cost above the 8-pipe Radeon X700 Pro, which ATI released within the year-long delay since S3's announcement. Again, not good for a card that was meant to compete against the X600 Pro. But I have the card in hand, and I have a rare opportunity to compare it against its rivals, intended and otherwise. The card's availability was either so poor or its sales were so low that this preview sample is literally the only example myself or anyone I know have run across in recent years. Yeah, that's right. This is in fact a preview sample, as indicated by the sticker on the original cooler that came on this card, which says as much. Basically, this was made by S3, presumably intended for reviewers or perhaps even system builders. And it's kind of interesting. I mean, I debated putting the newer cooler on it just because it seemed like it was in better overall condition, but there are differences between them. For starters, the stock cooler has this shroud that goes all the way down the sides here and is made of plastic, and the plastic shroud continues to the side where there is an exhaust on the top edge here, and as well going towards the rear of the card. So a little bit more fan exhaust, I guess, than the newer cooler. The shroud in this case does not extend down the sides. Instead, you have aluminum going all the way around, and in fact the side exhaust here is blocked off, save for just a little hole right there. So all of the air gets exhausted towards the rear of the card. I wasn't really sure that was necessarily better, so I just stuck with the stock cooler that came on the card originally, and it's perhaps more significant. It is representative of the final product. And to go against it, I have the Radeon X600 XT, a GeForce PCX 5750, and I'll throw in a Radeon X700 Pro just to show how far the market had moved on by the time this thing was released. The clock speeds and specs of each card are on screen for you to peruse. I debated downclocking the X600 XT to Pro speeds, but S3 did show the XT version up against the S18 line at a presentation they held at CeBIT 2005, and it's more fun to see it running at full throttle anyway, so we'll leave it be. The test system and driver details are in the video description as always if you're curious. We'll go over the S3's ChroMetal drivers in more detail after the test results. Now a quick note about testing. As usual, we use an overpowered CPU, in this case a Core 2 Duo E8600 at 4.5 GHz, in order to try and get the best performance possible out of each GPU, in the hopes of learning something new about them. With the drivers, the newest ones available for the GammaChrome S18 line are ChroMetal 4.9, which performs the best but also produces a few rendering issues, as we'll see later. The same is true for version 4.4, but 4.0 does not exhibit the same issues, albeit with worse performance across the board. Ultimately, I decided to just redo the 2 tests that were bugged using ChroMetal 4.0, while leaving the rest with the latest drivers, but I could see people choosing to go with 4.0 overall for a more consistent experience. We'll start with 3D Mark 2001 because I always like to have some sort of a legacy test in here to show how DirectX 9 cards fare in older workloads. The 3 older cards are all within arm's reach of each other, although the S18 Pro does lag behind the others a little. The X700 Pro shoots way ahead at around 10,000 points more, even with this older CPU-bound test. 3D Mark 03 shows some more interesting stratification of results than the previous one, with the S18 Pro pulling ahead of the PCX 5750, but still a good deal behind the X600 XT, which scores 29% higher. The X700 Pro scores about twice as much as the S18 Pro. And then when we look at a heavy shader model 2.0 test, we see the S18 Pro blow past the FX-based 5750, which at least shows its shader performance ascends well beyond NVIDIA's troubled architecture. It still doesn't match the X600 XT, and it's nearly a third of the performance of the X700 Pro. New to our test suite is Aquamark, a fairly intensive DirectX 8 benchmark that shows the S18 Pro and PCX 5750 close in the GFX score, with the latter card ultimately turning in an almost 17% better score. The ATI cards pull well ahead though, with the X700 Pro predictably embarrassing the rest of the lot. I put an asterisk next to the S18 Pro because this is one of the tests that exhibited issues with the newest drivers. During the large-scale vegetation rendering test, huge portions of the vegetation were missing or flickering, as seen here. With ChroMetal 4.0, everything renders correctly, but performance is significantly worse. For our older OpenGL 1.3 test, we see Call of Duty tightening up the scores against what is undoubtedly a low CPU ceiling. The biggest differences come in the form of the 1% lows, which see both the S18 Pro and X600 XT turning in disappointing results, while the other 2 cards proceed with flying colors. Unreal Tournament 2004 shows another tight race between the S3 card and NVIDIA's, with the exception being the 1% low, which is pretty abysmal on the GammaChrome card. The frame times are all over the place, as you can see here, but to be honest, during gameplay I really didn't notice it. This is also the second instance where there is a clear image quality drawback with using the latest drivers on the S18 Pro, because both shadows and decals have flickering issues, which is very distracting and detracting from the experience. ChroMetal 4.0 fixed this problem, but I lost about 5 FPS average in exchange. In Painkiller, the GammaChrome pulls well ahead of the PCX card, while falling well short of the X600 XT and even more so the X700 Pro. The 1% lows don't look particularly good for some of these cards, but that can be attributed to the game's Havoc physics engine causing hitches whenever something explodes. The S18 Pro doesn't do particularly well here with Half-Life 2, though unlike NVIDIA's Rankin series cards, it is capable of running in DirectX 9 mode. The 1% lows are particularly horrible, and you can see here in this footage how stuttery and unplayable the game is. Out of curiosity, I decided to run the S3 card in DirectX 8.1 mode to see if there was an improvement, and while the average frame rate did improve by about 23%, the 1% lows remained the same, pointing to a bigger issue with the drivers in this game, likely related to memory management. Far Cry was never particularly kind to FX series cards, being a pretty heavy DirectX 9 title, and the S18 Pro performs well ahead of it, into fairly playable territory by the standards of most gamers at the time. Of course, it's no candle to the X600 XT, and we needn't even bother comparing it to the X700 Pro. Our second OpenGL test flexes the features of the API heavily, and here the S18 Pro does admirably against the PCX 5750. S3 was particularly focused on Z rejection and Z fill performance with the GammaChrome architecture, able to accelerate stencil shadow operations, in theory, better than ATI's architectures of the time. That doesn't bear fruit here against the X600 XT though, which still handily beats both of them, although 1% lows aren't looking good on it. Now, averaging the 6 games tested, the GammaChrome S18 Pro is a closer rival to the PCX 5750 than either of the two Radeon cards, despite the X600 XT and Pro being a big focus of their marketing. It simply doesn't hold up to even its competition from 2004, and by the time it released a year later and the X700 Pro came out, the show was over. Alright, so let's go ahead and take a look at the driver interface that S3 Chrome uses. And you may hear a bit of fan noise in the background as I'm recording this. To get to the tools and utilities, you can do it the traditional way via display properties, settings, and advanced here. But you also have a tray icon that if you left click will bring up just a smaller menu with the ability to change display modes, some basic options pertaining to the tray icon itself, display property settings, which will take you to where we were just at, and about, which tells you about the Tray Plus tool. And if you right click, it brings up a larger menu, and this can take you to each individual what would have been tabs on the advanced display properties, and we'll take a look at each of these individually. And then you also have S3 Desk Toys, which by default is turned off, but I went ahead and turned it on just to kind of show you briefly what that's all about. So this is our standard desktop, excuse the mess, and you'll see this icon down here, which is our Desk Toys icon. And if I right click on that, we have the ability to bring up multiple V-desks or virtual desks. And you can see we're actually on number 2 right now, and we switch over to number 4, it doesn't look like anything changed. But if I go over to number 1, you can see we have a program open here. And if I go to number 3, we've got a different window open here. So these aren't really separate desktops in the literal sense, like you're not looking at a virtual multi-screen setup like some utilities are able to do. This is simply a way to have different programs open simultaneously without cluttering up the screen all at once, which I think is kind of a nifty kind of sort of idea there. And if you close it, so let's go over to here and we turn that off, then it just brings up all the programs that you had open on each virtual desk all at once. So it could be pretty handy, and you do have an option to switch between them via a desktop shortcut. So if we go to properties here, brings up a utility, you can add more virtual desktops if you want, and you can see the control key here, which you can set differently, and you can have different desktop backgrounds for each one to help you kind of distinguish between them, because again, you're going to have the same icons across each of those virtual desktops. But let's go ahead and go into properties and advanced here so we can have all the tabs available to quickly go through. And a lot of these pertain to display and color settings. So if we go to Gamma Plus, I think it's going to try to modify. Yeah, we'll just go back to default here. But of course, this is your color contrast, settings. You got your info tab, which gives you basic information about the driver, tells you how much video memory we have in the interface, and some other information about driver files and OpenGL ICD. We got even more color options here. S3 display, which allows you to control multi-monitor settings there. And then of course you have S3 rotate, which lets you rotate the screen if you have a monitor that will pivot. And if we go to S3 Chroma, we have settings for video, which I'm not really sure what the benefits are. You could do crazy effects like emboss, which just shows a preview of, neon edges, which is just an edge detect in real time, soft focus, and sharpen, which will make your image look horrible, but we'll go back to none, and deblocking, which I find hilariously exaggerates the effect. Wow, suddenly you can see the car. I'm sure it works exactly like that. Then we get into the, the actual 3D settings pertaining to the card itself. So in S3 config 3D, we do have settings for both Direct 3D and OpenGL. So in Direct 3D, we do have an option in the drivers for controlling VSync, trilinear filtering, and so on. And if we go to advanced, it will show us anti-aliasing, up to 4x, anisotropic filtering. And what's interesting about anisotropic filtering is you don't just see the standard 2, 4, 8, 16, you see a whole bunch of options in between, which I don't think I've ever seen on any other graphics card before. I'm not, as of recording this, I haven't tried any of these in between options, but that gives you a lot of nuances to your texture filtering. It'll be interesting to see if those work as advertised. And if we go into OpenGL, we do not have nearly as many options. We do have a VSync option, we do have an anisotropic filtering option, which again gives you the same level of granularity, but no option for anti-aliasing, which is a bit of a shame. Now under S3 Turbo, interestingly, we have a driver option for overclocking. You can see it goes all the way up to 500 on the core, potentially. Memory from 350 to 400, which would be 800 megahertz effectively. So not, a huge range there, but certainly probably well within the capabilities of the GPU. But we'll cancel that. So overall, I would say not by any means the worst. It's not going to be very extravagant, and you are missing some features with OpenGL as we saw, but it's actually not too bad, all things considered, especially considering this is the early 2000s, and I've seen much worse. In fact, in one of my previous videos with an SIS graphics card, there weren't even half these options, so they are welcome to have, but you do have other utilities you can use and potentially settings within the games themselves that will give you more adjustment of what the graphics card is actually capable of. So how do we summarize all of this that we just saw? Well, to be honest, I'm not really sure what to add here. In fact, this video was kind of difficult for me to make simply because I really didn't know what angle to approach this with. How do I make an interesting video out of a graphics card that literally no one was interested in? No outlets were even interested in reviewing it, even going so far as to release a statement saying that they weren't going to review it because it wasn't compelling enough for various reasons. And, something that literally nobody could have bought back in the day, or at least not easily, because, basically you had one option. You had S3's own G store where they were selling them directly to consumers online, and there was essentially no distribution. There was no board partners making these cards that I'm aware of. And, everything about this graphics card is the epitome of a disappointment. I mean, it was announced and was supposed to come out in 2004 and compete against two mid-range early PCI Express cards, and it didn't come out until the next year in 2005, where it was competing against much more powerful cards from both companies. And instead of adjusting the price accordingly, they stuck to the price, and it was too little, too late for too much money. I mean, I would be surprised to hear if anybody actually bought this card. I mean, it's quite telling that the marketing focused primarily on the video features, and maybe it was in some ways more robust than the competitors, but I mean, by the time we're talking, NVIDIA's Pure Video or ATI's Avivo, I mean, there was plenty of other options out there that were, compelling if that was your main concern, and available for cheaper, quite frankly. I mean, there was just no compelling value proposition with this product. And, case in point, this is the only example I've ever run across. And it's, a review sample, which is kind of ironic considering that there are hardly any reviews. The one review I did find from Beyond 3D wasn't even of this model, the Pro model. It was for the middle child, the Nitro version. It's kind of sad to think that maybe this card was sent out to a reviewer and the viewer was just like, and threw it in a storage unit or something somewhere for it to never see the light of day. And in fact, I might be the first person to review this graphics card. Not even back in the day, but at any point here on this channel. So I guess that's kind of fun in a way. There are really two reasons why something is rare. You might have something that is historically significant. It is something that was influential, caused a major change in either culture or an industry. It may be something that is a one-off. There's only one in existence. Or you might have something that was, at least to some extent, produced in some number, but in a very small number, but it's still interesting, compelling enough. Like, for example, the GeForce FX 5800 Ultra. It was a graphics card that was technically released, but as far as I can tell, was essentially pre-order only. I've heard some people say you might have been able to find it at brick and mortar stores, but it was extremely limited, and it was a card that was interesting at the same time for being one of the few major missteps by NVIDIA. I mean, we're talking a graphics card that was so notorious for various reasons that NVIDIA themselves later on made fun of it. So, I mean, it has historical context, maybe not for very flattering reasons, but it does have a historic component to that card. This is rare because no one bought it. It's rare because no one was interested in it. And it's not rare because it has any sort of historical significance. There is no demand for this graphics card. There wasn't back in the day, and there is virtually none today, although I imagine hardcore collectors out there might be interested in getting their hands on it, but only really as a shelf piece. I mean, this is not necessarily a graphics card you would want to use. I mean, I would, even for an early PCI Express platform, I would much sooner reach for an X600 Pro or XT or something along those lines. This is the definition. This is the poster child of mediocrity. Anyway, I think I ragged on this card enough for one day. And I hope at least some of you found this interesting. I don't know how to frame this. This is another one of those classic cases where a, third party vendor or, chip design company tried to compete in a market, even just the mid-range level of the market, and came up short. I mean, we've heard this story many times. I can't say countless times because few companies, especially as time went on, were willing to take the plunge into the market and spend all the money and effort and come out with something that ultimately misses its mark. It's very hard for a third-party company, as I mentioned in previous videos, to compete when you don't have the resources, you don't have the experienced engineers and driver teams and everything else that goes into creating a highly technically advanced product like a graphics card, like an advanced silicon chip. It's not easy, and there's a reason why so few companies have managed to survive over the years. It took me a long time just to make this video, and I'm forever grateful to Mike for sending it to me and trusting it with me and being incredibly patient while he waited for me to actually get this put together. And I'm glad to finally have covered it and finally get to the end of this video project so that I can frankly move on to more interesting video projects that I have down the way. So anyway, I guess I'll leave it there. So as always, thank you very much for watching. I'm Nathan, and this has been PixelPipes.